Hello everyone. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes as we can see the numbers climbing. So we'll just let a few people join and then we'll crack on. Okay, looks like we've steadied out a bit, so I suggest we get started. Okay, welcome to the session this morning. We have 2 hours in which we're going to cover Microsoft Teams adoption and security and governance. We're going to start with the security and governance piece, and today's agenda looks like this. So we will start off with an introduction from Richard Fisher at Microsoft. He will talk through the reason that this session is being held. And then we'll start with, as I said, the security and governance piece. And what we'll be looking at is how Teams and the various Microsoft components within 365 and some additional tooling from ourselves help to keep data safe within Teams. We'll then go into a Q&A session. So what I suggest is that you have access to a chat window as part of the webinar. Please do put your questions into there. And then what we'll do is at the end of it, around about 10:45 or so, we will go through all the questions that have been asked. And if we get to a point where we've run out of time for that, or there's things that need further discussion, or a grab a cup of coffee and have a proper conversation about security, then we can address those afterwards. Once we've done that, we will move into adoption and change management. And likewise, at the end of that, we'll have a Q&A session, and then there'll be a wrap up at the end, again, to make sure that everybody's got everything they needed from the session. So we'll dive over straight away and get into the introductions from Richard.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pete. So once again, everyone, thanks for joining this webinar. This is the second of the series that we've put together for you, and I would say that today's content is probably the hottest topic from a Teams rollout perspective. The two elements, the control and the governance, are questions that I probably get virtually every day from customers, because once you start rolling out Teams, you want to make sure you're doing it in a fashion that is really got control and the necessary governance around it. And I think what we're going to do today is show you how we can do that together with the likes of Modality, and they've also got some extra controls that they can offer as a value add for the whole adoption, just to understand what exactly people are doing on Teams. And also why the whole adoption and change management is really key to a successful Teams rollout. So hopefully you'll find the next 2 hours of real value. But what I wanted to just before I hand back to Pete, in my introduction last week, I announced that Microsoft were seeing about 45 million active daily users. In our latest quarterly report that came out Thursday of last week, we're now seeing 75 million active daily users, and that has grown since the end of March by over 30 million, which is quite phenomenal. And as you can tell, Teams is an application within the Office 365 stack that is critical at this current time, where we're all working from home and we all ultimately need to collaborate in order to keep our organizations going. So I'm hoping you'll find the next 2 hours of real value. I'll hand back over to Pete, and I'll be here for the majority of the next 2 hours, and I'll come back on at the end of it. So yeah, sit back and enjoy the content from Pete. Over to you, Pete.
I love the fact that you're encouraging people to enjoy this. I will make it as exciting as I can. Right. So let's start with the basic principles. Teams and the data that we're sharing now within the cloud environments is obviously escalating. It's growing and growing at a ridiculous rate. And we're moving much more towards a model where the applications and the data is accessible from anywhere, providing you've got an internet connection. And as this consumption and this continual growth develops, we need to make sure that the approach that we take around security and governance is very much ensuring that the data that we own as an organization is protected. When users can start to access any application from any device, laptop, tablet, smartphone, whatever it may be, and the fact that we're sharing data now with potentially external parties, third parties, suppliers, whatever it may be, the question for us is, how do we keep it safe, and what can we put in place to make sure that we've done the best that we can? So let's start with a comment actually from Microsoft's CEO, Satya Nadella. Security is the top priority. I'm committed to working with others across the industry to protect the customers. Okay, nice little statement, absolutely great. But what Microsoft have also said is that they are investing approximately $1 billion in cloud security each year. Now that's an enormous amount of money to protect the data that's there. And they've got to do it because basically there's a lot of data from a lot of customers, a lot of countries. So any kind of security risk would be, very, very damaging. Now, at any one time, Microsoft report that they get something like 1.5 million attempts to hack their infrastructure every day. And why is that figure significant? It's basically that information of people trying to gain access to the Microsoft systems can then be used to provide additional protection to you guys and to customers. They're basically learning from what's happening to themselves and then pushing that out into their products. So the security suite is pretty comprehensive, but is also based on information that is real world because it's happened to them. Now, when we're in customers and we're talking through how do we secure the data in Teams, there are lots of questions from security organizations, security roles within those discussions. But what we find is that actually a lot of it is coming back to some of the basics. So how do we control access to the services? And the principle around it is, who's trying to access it? What are they trying to access it? Where are they trying to access it from? So we want to make sure that we get those questions answered properly. And when we come to the actual data itself, how do we stop data getting out? And how do we make sure that we restrict the access, or etc. Now, this isn't a public sector thing, this isn't a private sector thing, this is across the board. But if you take it at a very sort of basic level, that information there, they just want to know how we control people getting access to the data and how we make sure the data is safe. So the questions are actually quite elementary. So what is available to us to help with the security and governance, and compliance side? The principle that we want to do is at the very beginning, or as early as you can in the process, we want to make sure that we've actually defined a security and compliance and governance process around teams. So that we've split it into two angles for today. The first one is around security, and that is, who do we know is accessing the data? How do we protect that data? The second part is, how do we manage the governance and the life cycle around the team's information? And part of that comes into play is not only from housekeeping and best practice, and so people can actually find the information they want and not legacy information that should have been archived off, but it's also so that you don't end up in a situation where there are multiple teams with similar names, or maybe there's a typo or something like that, and therefore membership or data gets put into a team it shouldn't be put into. So the governance still plays a part of that that whole security concept. So we need to make sure that this is all defined up front. And there are certain, I would say, common factors that we can apply across the board that we've learned from other organizations. And we did a session a while ago about saying, if you want to move to teams rapidly, this is the kind of thing you should have in place to get you up and running. So let's move on to the actual security section, and we'll keep this brief because I want to go into some of the sort of the visualization stuff a bit later on. The first part, how strong is your identity and access security? So the very simple question here is, if I'm trying to access information in Teams or potentially even another part of Office 365, how do I know the person accessing it is who they say they are? So if Kieran is trying to gain access to Teams or a document in the background, I need to make sure I know that it's Kieran who's accessing it. And so really, we need to make sure that whatever we put in place is secure, but is also easy to use. If we make this complicated, then people are going to be less likely to use it. So if we look at some of the options available to us around this, we have very basic passwords. Yes, they can be stuck on Post-it notes on screens, they can be hacked. You know, I worked in an organization, a large electronics firm, a good few years ago. Got a little bit tired of the security approach, so handed a whole bunch of people their passwords after having hacked them. To which I was faced with the fantastic argument of, you don't know what that word means. So I don't need to know what that word means. I've got the letters and numbers right in front of me. So we start with the password piece. We then move up to two-factor authentication. And what we're looking at here is bringing in a combination of what you know and what you have. So a key would be potentially put into a USB slot, or if you've got an RSA token, you type in the number that's on the screen, etc., at the same time as you do your password. We then move into making things much more user-friendly with the Authenticator app from Microsoft. And then we can go into things like FIDO2, which is the next level, and it simplifies things even further, but it still sticks to the principle of something you have and something you know. We then want to look at actually conditional access. So this is where it comes back to the who, where, and when. So the first part in the top piece, user and location, that is, Kieran is trying to access this information. How do I know it's Kieran, and is he accessing it from the right place? So we go back to that authentication piece. Yep, I've approved it. I know it's Kieran. He's got his what he knows and what he has. He's all passed those tests. We then need to look at Kieran's device. If we're using Teams, and Teams is accessible from an awful lot of places, an awful lot of devices, if you've got somebody accessing data on a device that is potentially home PC. You know, everybody's working from home at the moment. How do we know that that home PC has got antivirus and is up to date and the security patches are on and all this sort of stuff? So we could say, yes, Kieran has passed the test. Well done, Kieran. What are you accessing it from? You're accessing it from a corporate device. Brilliant. Thanks very much. That's the next tick. If we find that the device that Kieran is trying to access from doesn't meet the guidelines and the conditions that we put against it, we can reject his approach at that point. We don't want Kieran downloading information or accessing information from something that is not secure. So we can look at the device that he's accessing it from. And then we look at what he's actually trying to access. So wants to access this set of information that's a SharePoint document. It's being surfaced in Teams. Is he actually allowed access to that information? So provided we get tick on all of those areas, then we can actually say, yeah, brilliant, that's secure. I'm happy with who he is and I'm happy where he's connecting it from. So that's the approach that we want to sort of take with this thing. And how you phase this in, you know, is up to conversations around how quickly and what sort of subscriptions you've got with your licensing. So for the data side of it, what do we do with that? Well, we've got the various different sort of tooling available within Office 365. So there is advanced threat protection. So that SharePoint information, that OneDrive, the data that we're storing in there, that can be protected pretty much by turning on a function within your 365 platform. And we can also enable other things like data loss prevention. We can make sure we've got retention policies in place so that we meet compliance regulations, etc., etc. The main point about this is that there are a good number of tools available within that 365 suite. And if you look at it from a security angle, most organizations won't consider deploying tools to this level if they had to go and buy everything individually. The fact that you can look at your 365 subscription and say, actually, do you know what? I need to turn on threat protection. I need to turn on data loss prevention, is making things very much more straightforward. It's there, it's ready to be used. You just need to enable it, turn it on, configure it, and get it going. This is changing the model away from what used to be the mentality on premise, where you'd have to go and buy this application to secure that or install this to protect something else as well. This is all here for you. We just need to use it. And this comes into play when we start to look at other stuff as well, when we come onto the demos. The other thing we need to look at is reporting. So when we're talking about security, it's all very well putting in place, but we need to see what's happening as well and see whether or not we need to improve anything or change anything else. And you again have lots and lots of information available to you. This one here is the impossible travel, which is one of my favorites really. The user performed an impossible travel activity, which is great. Basically means that they've logged in from an IP address in Malaysia, and then 67 minutes they logged into an IP address from UK. Okay, they can't have traveled that distance, so something's probably wrong there. So let's flag it up. Let's have a little look. Now it might be they used some sort of remote desktop, etc., to gain access to something. I don't know, but that would be typically from a, you know, a very, very, very small use case. So if we can identify things like this, then we can start to protect ourselves much more effectively. And there's a lot of information available to you. You know, this is a typical activity log. It tells you what the failure was, who it was, the IP addresses it came from. It gives you, you know, the groups, it gives you the time, date, etc. So there's an awful lot of information for you there to be able to go and make some judgment calls on. So So security is not just a case of put it in place and forget. We also want to make sure that we look after the data that we've got. We then come on to the governance and lifecycle management, and this is where we start to move into what we do and what we'll have a look at in just a second. So once you've got your security and governance model in place, we need to make sure that as we start to roll out teams and we allow the users to create their teams, we need to make sure that that governance is put in place at that point of creation. So it's all very well saying, yeah, we know this is our naming convention, let's force that naming convention. It might be that we want to build in some kind of logic behind it to say, well, you know, if it's a public team, then maybe we don't allow external members in it. So all of the stuff that we have in that security defined or governance defined policy, we want to make sure it's laid down at that point of creation of the team. Other organizations have said, yeah, we don't want users creating teams. We're going to create them through a central controlled team. That's fine. That's your choice. But Teams really is designed to be very flexible. So if a user wants to create a team because they need to work with Kieran and Paul and Linda on this particular product or this challenge, then we can create that team and we can get it going. But we need to make sure it's freedom for the users to go about this, but in line with the governance that we're laying down at this point. So yes, you can go ahead and create what you want, but it's under our rules. The other part we need to look at is once you've laid down all of this governance and security at the point of creating a team, is you need to make sure it stays in line with that for the life cycle of that team. So if I've defined 2 owners and one of those owners leaves, I'm then in breach of the governance that we've laid down. How do I know? Now I can go trawling through reports, or I can look at something like this. But we need to make sure that we don't end up with lots of old teams, legacy teams, teams that aren't being used, teams that have people in them that should no longer be in them, that kind of thing. So let's have a little look at the demo in a second. But the main point here is you can roll out teams and you can crack on with it and get people using it. If you don't apply that security and governance, the pain will come later on. And I don't want this to sound like a big sort of, oh, we're going to scare you away from it. It's not the case. But if you have an organization with 5,000 members, or 5,000 users in it, and they're all allowed to create teams, if one person creates an unnecessary team in a 3-month period or something, that's a lot of teams that you've then got to go and tidy up afterwards. So getting that governance in early and just keeping on top of it is super important because it will save you a lot of pain later on. Okay, I'm going to swap screens now. And hopefully you should be able to see my other screen. Okay, so this is our approach to the way that we lay down that governance and the way that we create that that team. All of this stuff is available through the Microsoft tools that we've talked about. What we're doing is bringing it together in one place so that you don't have to go off and say, set a policy against this, and then do something else against that, and then apply templates from somewhere else or whatever it may be. All of this is brought into one place. So the process of creating a team becomes very, very simple. The principle we use is we take away the default way that a user creates a team. So if I were to go into the Teams icon here, I'd have a join and create team at the bottom. What I do is actually, I want to make sure that when we create teams, this is what we use. So this is our sort of sweetie shop version of it. So we've got basically all of the 3 options that we provide. You would typically choose 1, maybe 2 of these. So the first way is we can create something from a template. Okay, so all we do is we go into create team, we drop down, and we can choose what type of template we want to apply. So that could be something to do with, I don't know, client engagement, it could be customer services, it could be one of the directorates for, I don't know, social or some sort of citizen-facing function. But we can pick a template from there, and we can go and click create. All of these lead to the same place. So if I click on create now, we get the same sort of image as we will do when we go back into the other ones. So what we have is creating from a template. We can copy an existing team. So if we know that there is one that we like the look of, we can go and use that as the basis for it. Or we can create a team from scratch, which is what we'll do now. So when I create my team from scratch, I'm forced to put in the team name, obviously. And as I type in, I go for sales. What I want to see is, are there any other teams that are called sales? My internet connection is playing up today. There we go. As I type in sales, I get a list of all the teams that are named similar to sales or contain the word sales. And if I've already joined them, it tells me. If I haven't already joined them, I get a little plus button to join it. So what I'm looking at is instantly preventing what we refer to as team sprawl. So I want to create a team called Sales Global or Global Sales, whatever it is. I get prompted that there was one already in existence. Okay, so I don't want to get to the point of where somebody's entered customer ABC and another one's entered customer A.B.C. Okay, so it's making sure that we get rid of similar named teams or teams with duplicate names. We can then force the description, put in whatever it is that we want. We can force the amount of characters in the description. We can force the naming convention. Okay, that's using the policies and stuff from Microsoft. When we get to the point about what kind of team it will be, we can provide some guidance if we wanted to. And we can start to build in this logic saying, well, if it's a public team, then I'm going to disallow guests. Okay. The reason we might want to do that is if you have a public team where someone can drop in and drop out of the team and doesn't need any kind of moderation or validation that they are allowed to see that information, do you necessarily then want external parties coming in and viewing whatever's being discussed in there? Probably not. We can also force the number of owners. So when we hit the minimum number of owners, the warning sign goes away, and we can then add in however many members we want to be part of that team as well. If I click create on here, and I've met all of the criteria, that will then just go ahead and create the team. If there's anything that's slightly in question, maybe the team name is too similar to something else, or we don't like the fact that we're going to say yes, public and guests are combined, then we can send that off to moderation. It could be that we take all of this information, and when we click create, it goes off for moderation anyway. We can be very flexible with the workload, the workflow. But what we're trying to do is make sure that all of our governance tick boxes are all in place. Okay, and that is the way that we lay down the governance at the beginning. This is a very simplified version. If you wanted to apply some sort of security logic around it, we can do that too. But this is just getting across the principle. So once we've got that, what happens to the management of the data that we're seeing? Well, this is where we start to interpret the data that is already within Office 365. So this is our analytics suite, or part of our analytics suite. This is the security and governance module. The data that is in Office 365, we pull that out into a SQL database, which resides within your tenant. This data never leaves your environment. With it, we will then carve up and present the data back to you in a more meaningful way. So what we do is we have the ability to break things down by date range, particular team, whether or not we want to go for a department, and quite usefully, a user adoption group. So it might be that if you're doing a pilot, you only want to look at a certain group of users. So we can carve it up anyway. If your Active Directory is not necessarily 100% up to scratch, we can pull information from something like an HR tool or something like that to make sure that the source of information is correct. The screen that we're looking at here shows us anything in pink is in breach of governance. So where we said that we needed 2 owners, we're looking at some teams here. These have all got 1 or no owners. So what we would do is, let's take one with a 1 owner, is we can say, yeah, brilliant, that's easy. We've scrolled down this report and we've seen that this team is in breach of its regulations, or in breach of its governance. What do we do with that information? Well, we've got several options. First thing is, we could just let you see it and you go, okay, I really need to go and have a chat with APAC marketing. The other thing we can do with it is apply the principle that if we can measure it, we can set a threshold, and if we can set a threshold, we can set an action. So what we're doing is encouraging the owners of the teams to be more responsible for the management of that team. IT teams are typically very busy, and not necessarily the people who know whether or not a team should be active, or who should be an owner of the team, or who shouldn't be, etc. The owners of the teams are going to be the people who know that information. So where we've got this APAC marketing with 1 owner, we can say, yeah, okay, we've seen that that's got 1 owner. What are we going to do? Well, actually, what we'll do is we'll trigger off a message back to that team owner that will say, you own this team. The regulation is that you have 2 owners. There's only 1. Please add an additional owner to bring your team back in line with the governance. And we can apply that principle to many, many things. So where we've got the last message date, it's been over 300 days since that team was used, then we can take the same approach. Is that team still needed? I don't know. I'll send a message to the owners to say, team's not been used for a while. Is it still needed? And that can be applied to a number of different areas. But this is really to give you a glimpse of what's in breach of governance compliance, and we can tweak and twiddle with this to make sure we meet your requirements. This is the data set that we have at the moment for demos. And we've put some pre-canned views and reports in for you. So we can click on this one and it will show us the inactive teams, which haven't had any messages or activity for the last 30 days. And all of this data is drilled through. So if you wanted to get to the information in the background, you can right click and you can drill through and have a look at the interactions and the timelines against it. We can also have a look at things like guests in public teams. So the piece that we talked about beforehand, where we might want to block that, that's absolutely fine. We can take that same approach. Well, actually, you've got a public team, you've got a guest in it. Maybe we want to allow it, but maybe this time we'll send a message back to the owner to say, please, can you validate that these external guests are still valid? And that could be on a periodic basis. We've included a governance reporter to make sure that you can pick and choose and do a sort of a filtering service on it. I apologize for the speed of my broadband connection. This is better than it was earlier on. And that will say, okay, I want to see similar named teams that have external guests in them to maybe I try and identify what's going on. But we can also take this down to a level where we start to look at the files and what kind of files are being stored in teams, whether or not they are in areas that they should be, whether or not somebody has actually changed the SharePoint permissions in the background to be different from what's represented in Teams. If I think my document is secure in Teams because it's only Kieran and Paul, and then I go to SharePoint and find that somebody's actually made it public, that's potentially a risk. So all we do there is we're comparing the two sets of permissions. If it's wrong or it doesn't match, then maybe we send a message back to, could be security and governance team, it could be the owner again. We can work out what that workflow is, but the idea is we're not leaving this stuff to risk. And the other thing we can do is look at bringing in things like data loss prevention to turn around and say, okay, we've got these documents have been placed into this team, and according to our policies, the DLP, this shouldn't be the case. So maybe we see that happen, we flag it straight up to security and governance, straight to the owner. Maybe we take some sort of positive action on it and say, yeah, we're going to quarantine that or whatever it may be. But the idea is that we are not leaving things to risk. If you try to mine your way through the reports to get to this kind of information, it's quite a time-consuming job. So let's make the owners responsible for a fair old chunk of it, and then maybe then your team will be involved in things where it is, I've repeatedly asked Kieran to fix this 3 times, he hasn't, now I'm going to escalate it and deal with it on a human level, so that it gets resolved in a timely fashion. That's a very small sort of packaged version of it. Typically, a conversation of going through this will be a sort of an hour and a half type conversation. So we're quite happy to do that if you want to look at any more of that. But for the moment, I'm actually going to hand over to Paul Morgan, who's the account director for public sector, just to talk about some of the impact we've had on other customers.
Okay, thanks, Pete. I think we just need to get the slide deck back in play.
Yeah, just realised I'm showing the wrong screen. That should be with you in just a second. There we go.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is just to, I guess, to give a flavour for the types of organisation in public sector that we've worked with in the past. It's by no means an exhaustive list, and yeah, we've worked with some fairly large customers. Kent County Council was a 10,000 user deployment, and we've also worked with 50 user schools. So it varies wildly, and we've provided a whole raft of professional services such as consultancy, user adoption, project management, etc., and then sort of support thereafter. So, as I said, that gives you a flavour. I just wanted to home in on a couple of particular customers that are fairly topical about what we're talking about today. On the next slide, and Development Bank of Wales. We've been working with them now for about the last sort of 6 months. They had a Skype for Business Online deployment, but they had a fairly poor uptake from a user adoption perspective. And they wanted to take a different approach with the migration to Teams, and effectively wanted to empower the users, but to have some degree of control. So we put in the Create Team module with the governance and security module that have just been demonstrated to you, along with a training package to make sure that all of the users, their noses were pointing in the right direction. And yeah, they've had some quite spectacular results. I mean, this is a sort of case study that we've got that happy to email it to anybody. But they've had a 90% active Teams usage, over 500% increase in Teams meetings, and an internal email decline by approximately 20,000 messages per month. It's also enabled them to ramp up far quicker on remote working in the light of COVID-19. Which obviously has been sort of fairly topical for all of us of late. At the other end of the spectrum, EY are one of our largest customers. I think they're about 220,000 users worldwide, and we've been working with them for about the last sort of 4 years now. and principally been involved in a migration from Skype for Business to Teams, and the teamwork analytics package that we've touched on and we're going to cover off in the next session has been instrumental in helping them to manage that process, and quite a rigorous adoption and change management as part of a managed service. And we're also at the stage now of providing sort of billing capabilities so they can break down the billing of their Microsoft calling plans, by department, by user if necessary, just to give them a more granular view of how costs should be apportioned within the organization. So again, that's a little flavor. I'm sure if anybody wants a bit more detail, we can provide that under NDA. So if I may, I'll hand back to Pete.
Yep, thanks, Paul. Okay, so the principles behind it are, when we're securing data in Teams, Teams is really underpinned by an awful lot of this stuff. There is the security and governance side around Teams, but we want to make sure that we don't miss the basics around how we protect data in general, which we're going to be surfacing through Teams. So multi-factor authentication, the conditional access piece, the who, what, when, and how, the data protection of the advanced threat protection that we can turn on, data loss prevention, etc. It's all there for you, but we need to make sure that we combine that with a proper lifecycle management, and then the data will be safe within your Teams environment. So I think we're 3 minutes ahead of target. So Paul, have we had any questions in? Please don't say no.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have. But we've got 3 minutes if anybody can scribe quite quickly.
No, nothing at all.
Okay. I mean, I had one that came up from a customer meeting a couple of weeks ago now that it was interesting. And again, it may come out perhaps in the next session, but how do we actually prevent a user inadvertently placing a confidential document into a Teams channel that contains external guests? So I don't know if that's a function of Teams per se, or whether it's more of a DLP or other security related question. But it's quite an interesting one.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different angles to it. So first is the DLP side, and what you want to wrap around that. So I've got a document that's got a particular phrase, or maybe we've got something classified on the document, and we can say that document type should not be allowed in within a particular sort of Teams. So what we're really doing is we're bringing together a couple of things. The DLP on its own will work to a certain point, but bringing together that analytics walkthrough that we did earlier on, where we talked about where the files were, etc. We can apply an additional level of logic to it to say, well, this type of content should not be in this kind of location. And at that point, we have to decide whether or not we take an action of reporting, which is obviously after the event, compared with whether or not we actually want to do something a little bit more aggressive and say, okay, well, we're going to remove that document, or quarantine it, or whatever it may be that we want to actually do with it. But it does come down to how much automation you want to apply around it, and whether or not you want documents to be handled automatically by a bot or a service. So
I think it's also worth adding there, Pete, that as you've got on screen, with anything to do with security in Teams, as you kind of touched on there, it's about defense in depth. It's about layering these applications on top of each other to give you that best security posture within Teams. So as you've mentioned, DLP, we can apply sensitivity labels to documents, etc. And then we can layer on all these security features that come with Office 365 to give us that better security posture within a Teams environment.
Okay, so a question for you then, Kieran, following on from that, is if you've gone down that route in the conversation with the customer, when you start to talk about layering up, what sort of reactions do you get? Do you get pushback? Do you get understanding and acceptance? What sort of response do you get?
I think there's a perception generally that people expect one layer of security to fix a multitude of sins effectively, where it's actually it's an educational piece about saying, well, actually conditional access and Azure information protection will prevent this kind of challenge. But when you look at things like what Paul suggested in terms of, right, well, how do I look at the challenge from stopping certain type of documents being placed in certain locations, it's a case of, yeah, well, you need to do the basics, you need to do the groundwork, and then you need to add on these security features within Office 365 to enable us to get to that level of security that you need to. And it's often customers understanding those layers and, all right, I didn't realize that we had that particular feature within Office 365 in the security suite to enable us to do this. Or what we tend to find is with Teams especially, the response is, we never even thought about that as a challenge or an issue, for example.
Okay.
I think from my perspective is when you have these conversations with security CIOs or whatever the person who's involved is that yes, there's a realization that potentially this hadn't been considered, but then when you start to talk about what is available in Microsoft 365, a lot of those problems go away. It does mean that something else needs to be deployed or enabled or whatever it may be, but the concern goes away and then turns into a challenge of, right, okay, so how do we enable this then?
Yeah, a lot of the challenges go from a security challenge, don't they, into a compliance challenge.
Yeah,
that's what we're finding. And also the fact that people tend to forget, right, because it's Teams, it's collaboration, and it's like, oh yeah, actually we're forgetting that we're putting our greatest asset of our business, which is our data, into a cloud platform. We need to secure it, and we need to make sure we maintain that compliance.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I was about to ask Paul whether or not there are any more questions, but it's showing him as offline. Okay. So if that's the case, then I suggest that we move across to the next topic, which is the adoption and change management part. So we are slightly ahead of time, but I'm sure everybody will be happy to get an extra 10 minutes or something before lunch break. So let's go into the adoption and change management part. So when we go through this, I like to start with the basics of what is change management. So we hear a lot about training users. Microsoft have been using this adoption and change management phrase for a good couple of years now, but I wanted to break it into its various components. So change management itself is all about dealing with the user side of change. So there's nothing technical in this component whatsoever. When you combine adoption and change management, that's when we start to talk about technical impacts and how we get people to adopt it. But the change management is about how people respond to change. And there's two key areas to it. The first one is that you'll quite often hear it boiled down to ADCAR. Now, this is actually one tool out of a process or a framework to deal with individual change. ProSci, which is where the ADCAR component comes from, and most change management frameworks will follow a similar sort of pattern. but we're going to stick with the pro site one. So we have the add card process for the individual change, and then on the right hand side of the screen we have areas where we look at how the leadership of the project will be handled, what the expectations are, the project management side of it, how we deal with the change management. But this is very much from a much more of a project framework style. So if we go through the add card part first, the first part, A, awareness. So this is a message that needs to come from two places. This is where you're telling your users that the change is coming. The very first part will be from your executive sponsor. Okay, so somebody from the business side who is standing there saying, we need to do this. This is not a technology, this is not the CIO, CTO, or whatever it may be saying, we're putting out a new tool. This is, we're going to make some changes, and this is why we're going to make it. It will be, this is why we want to do it. This is why it's important to us. This is what happens if we don't do it. So I want you to be on board with this. I want you to embrace the product. I want you to embrace the change. So that comes from your exec sponsor. So that is somebody, it could be the CEO, it could be somebody from, a directorate or something like that. But it's somebody with seniority within the organization. The second part of awareness is that we want to, as individuals, we want to receive a message from our direct line manager to say, this is how it affects you. So from the very person, on the ground floor, entry level, they will be looking to their supervisor or to manager to go, well, this change is coming, but what does it mean to me? So we need to make sure that the two-tiered approach is, this is the big corporate message, this is why we need to do it, why we need to get on board with it. And then there's this lower level message, which is, this is how it affects my team, this is how it affects you as users. So we combine those two together. It is important to remember, though, that me as a manager, and I have my team, I will want to know how it affects me as an individual before I then go on and deal with managing my team through this change. So we have to remember that all managers, all line managers, senior heads of department, supervisors, etc., they're all users before they are people managers. So we need to make sure that they're comfortable on that level too. We then have the desire. The desire is basically us wanting the users to want to use it. We create desire for them. If you have someone who's looking at a new tool set, Teams, for example, and you turn around and say, God, all those emails that bounce backwards and forwards, and you've got to collate all the information from the changes and the different emails that are going on. If you could work like this, wouldn't it be great? You're all working on the same document. If you can trigger something that makes them want the product or to use the solution or whatever it may be, then you've got somebody who wants to change. And that makes a massive difference, because you're not foisting something upon them. You've told them how it's going to help, then they want to use it, and they're on board with you largely already. It's not the end of the job, but it's a large hurdle that you've got over. The knowledge piece, that's where we train. We train people, we coach people, and we make sure that any concerns, reservations, lack of knowledge, etc., that's brought to the surface so that we can deal with it. If we let things like this fester, that's when you end up with people becoming disaffected and they don't want to use the product, and it's a bad experience from them, and they will find shadow IT, etc., to help solve their problems. The ability part is getting them to use the product or the solution, and then the reinforcement piece is, how do we make sure that that change is sustained? How do we get to the point where the people who are disengaged are re-engaged? So for example, if I have a team of 25 people who work for me, and I message everyone in Teams, and only 15 of them are actively involved in Teams, so are liking and responding to the messages, I'll get to a point where Teams then becomes an inefficient tool. I'll drop back to something like email, old ways of working creep back in, etc. So we want to make sure that out of those 25, if we can see that 10 of them aren't really on board with it, then we can flag it, we can raise it back to them and say, okay, what's not working? And if we can find out that, we can fix that problem, add that additional training in, whatever it may be, then we will get them back on board to being part of that change. So that's the ADCAR process. The part on the right-hand side, project management. Do you have sufficient project management in place? It's relatively straightforward assessment from that side. Do you have the change management team in place to be able to deal with this? Again, that's relatively straightforward. The leadership sponsorship piece is interesting from my side, because if I am a manager or if I am the CEO of an organization and I'm saying, use Teams, it's great, and then I just carry on sending emails, that is the wrong message. If I, as my team owner, and I have my 25 people or whatever it was that we said, I'm sitting there going, we've been told to use Teams, but I really don't see. I can't get my head around it. I can't be bothered. That is the message that will go into the team. So we're talking about making sure that what we're doing, the actions portrayed by the leadership, the exec sponsors, down through the line managers, is the behavior that we want to see driven into the company. So a lot of this is about assessing what's missing and how people should behave, and pulling any sort of, as I said, concerns or qualms to the surface. And I'm going to set as an example here. It's very much a tongue-in-cheek session, but this is about a friend of ours called Ned. And some of you may be familiar with Ned before if you've joined one of my ACM sessions in the past. So Ned is a real character from history. He lived about the time of the Industrial Revolution, around Nottingham area, the textile industry. And of course, during this point, there was lots of new machinery being introduced. There was lots of new technology. Ned's friends, family, the people around him were worried basically that the machinery would take their jobs away. And basically Ned came up with a solution, and his solution was to smash up the machinery. So in change management terms, Ned is showing signs of resistance. So how can we look to change this? Well, bearing in mind this was the Industrial Revolution, Ned will not have had a change management conversation. So here's a slightly sort of, as I said, tongue-in-cheek approach to it. Boss turns around and says, the industry's changing. We need machines to make us more competitive and productive, or we'll go out of business and you'll lose your jobs. Ned is obviously very concerned and say, the machine's going to replace me. I need the job. Machinery will take away the back-breaking work you do and allow you to do things that will bring greater value to the company. Ned replies with the fact that there's no more back-breaking tasks and I can do more important things. Sounds great, but I don't know how to use the machines. Boss replies with, don't worry, you'll get full training and a consultation period. Now, obviously that's relatively sort of nonsensical. So why have I put it up there? Is because when we're talking about that ADCAR process, that very simplistic conversation is telling Ned why we need to make the change. It's then telling him that he doesn't have to deal with this sort of stuff. He's going to work in this new way. So actually there's benefit to Ned because he doesn't have to do this back-breaking stuff. And then he's going to get the knowledge piece, which is the training, the education on how to use the equipment. So that's where we sort of start with the change management bit. That's what it's all about. And we know from 20 years worth of research from ProSci that you stand an increase of sort of 65 to 85% when you implement change management along with training, etc. Now, for us, we know that the change management on its own isn't enough, and we know that training on its own isn't enough. We do plenty training, and we have done over the years, but for us, we break it down now into 3 clear options. One is your change management, your ProSci, your full program, and it's very heavy lifting on talking to people about how they feel about the change, so we have that as an option, but it's not necessarily our first port of call. We have the ability to deliver training material, and some organizations will just want to go for flat training. Okay, and then we have the blend of adoption and change management services, where we bring the change management data, like we saw with the security and governance, and some additional support services that help you really make the message stick. So what does it look like? Well, this is what it looks like from our perspective. We are aware that the conversations that form a large part of the change management piece don't necessarily allow us to be super aggressive on or agile, sorry, on how we roll out adoption and change management teams. So we have some change management foundations, and we look at the structure, we look at the behavior of the exec sponsor, we look at whether or not all the components and the building blocks are in place to make sure that whatever we roll out is going to meet your needs. We have to understand the impact of the change from a technology perspective, because that's super important. To give you an example, if we have a team who is already recording their hours or expenses in a system, and they're a large team, if you're implementing a replacement for solution for that, you're actually just changing the tooling. You're not changing the way they work. If you were to introduce that same set of tools into a smaller team who have never done any of that stuff before because they've never had to, that is actually a bigger cultural change for that small group of users than it would be for that larger team that are already doing something similar. So we need to understand the impact of the change. We then offer 3 plans. There are 5 available, but we tend not to see much interest in the coaching and resistance plans because of our data analytics that goes hand in hand. So the sponsor roadmap is there to say, yeah, okay, you're the exec sponsor of this project. We need to see you doing this. We need some messages out like that. This is the kind of behavior. We want your meetings to be on Teams. We want you to do this, and sort of draw people in from your lead by example approach. Comms plans, those are traditional comms plans in the fact that these are the users we're going to be migrating, so let's tell them what's coming. We'll show them, we'll get the desire built up. We'll then look at saying, you know, it's coming now, it's coming, it's here. And we'll build out what sort of media that is, whether that's on Yammer, whether it's emails, whether it's video stream, whatever it may be. The training plan is building out alongside that migration path what components of training we're actually going to put in place and how we're going to deliver that. Now, obviously, at the moment, with everybody being pretty much at home, we're seeing a massive increase in remote training. And that has some good sides and it has some bad sides. The good sides is that we can increase the number of attendees. The downside is that as effective increasing the numbers as it would be if you had a smaller room full of people. The blend is somewhere in between. The coaching plans and resistance plans, as I said, we'll part those up. The way we deal with coaching is we look at the organizational structure and we say, okay, these are the managers and the line managers and heads of department who are going to be affected by this change. These are the ones who have teams of people. Therefore, we're just going to give them some coaching. And that will explain to them, this is why the change is happening. It will give them a bit more information, explain the tools, how it can help, but it will also go on to the whole ethos around, if I'm negative, my team will be negative. Okay, so it will help them understand their role and how their behavior will affect the effectiveness of the rollout. And and we can encourage them at that point to surface any negativity or doubts that they have about the solution that we're looking to put in. There's a champions program. Champions program is there really to support your end user base, and this is around technology in the fact that we know through research that the best way that people learn now in general is by learning from their peers. So if we make sure that there are some champions who are super skilled up, then it gives everybody in a department or a floor or a team or whatever it is that we decide is the right approach. It gives them the ability to have someone to go to and say, how do I do this? How do I do that? So we need to make sure that the champions who are involved in that are very comfortable in what they're dealing with. We also have to make sure that with the champions program that we get it right, because quite often what we're seeing is that the champions program is now effectively becoming a triage system before queries and issues hit the service desk. If it's a straightforward thing like my team's client keeps crashing or something like that, then yeah, okay, that can go to the service desk. But if it's how-to questions, we don't necessarily want that going into the service desk. So maybe those champions can answer those for you. The training section on the right-hand side, we have a lot of content. We have a lot of ways of delivering this. Obviously, some of these are restricted at the moment around the classroom, the tech bars, etc. But there's a lot we can do, and we're delivering training for the moment, champions programs and training for some very large organizations, public and private sector. So the whole COVID situation has not stopped the rollout of ACM programs. We're seeing people still wanting to say, this is how we want to educate our users, and this is how we want to make sure it sticks. The bottom left-hand corner, the ACM stats and data, we will look at in a minute, because that is very much in line with what we were looking at for the security and governance, but it's from a user angle. And we look at the data to say, I've trained team ABC, or these teams on functionality A, B, C, D, and E. What I can actually see is that they've been trained on it, but they're only using A. So I want to make sure that they're not disengaged on B, C, D, and E. So I can look at it, I can see if they're using it. Maybe I send some automation, maybe I feed it back into the project to say, yeah, we've trained these guys, but they're not using it. Let's go and have a little chat with them and see if there's something wrong. That process of using the data, using that automation and reinforcing what you've trained and what you've educated your users on is where we allow ourselves to scale much more rapidly than doing a traditional change management approach with the heavy lifting up front. So we're still putting the framework in place, we're still putting all the components in place, but we're saying, yeah, okay, we've serviced 500 people on this wave of adoption. We can see that this team over here has got it, they understand it, these ones are using it, that's all great. I'm going to target in now on my next phase of reinforcement, which will be to that team, that group of users, which means that we can be very, very, very efficient on the way that we target people. Once we've got those teams who were disengaged up to a sensible level, we can continue to elevate everybody and give them additional tips and tricks and advice and little videos and things like that based on their usage and based on how we want them to work. Okay, so that is a super important message, and we'll have a look at the kind of data, as I said, in just a second. We've then also got support mechanisms. So your support mechanisms are especially important for IT and champions. And one of the things that people forget is that your IT team and your champions, whilst they're in the front line of making this change happen from an end user engagement and a technical perspective, they are still users. So we need to make sure that they've got the support they need in order to be able to do a confident job in making sure that everybody's got the answers they need. So the way we tend to do that is through hypercare services. So if you have VIPs, you might want some white glove treatment, some extra in-depth training, whatever it may be. If you've got your support desk and your IT champions, then we can provide them with things like a bot service, which is basically if they come across a problem that they've not encountered before, or they want some advice on something, they can just send us a message. We will respond to that message, just a chat message. We'll open it up. We can do an audio call. We can do a screen share. We can give that person the information they need and show them so that they can then go back and answer that question. So it's service desk to service desk or champions to an advice sort of service in the background. Pull that all together and you will end up with an adoption rate somewhere in the sort of the 85 to 90%. Once we've got that momentum, the rest will follow. Okay, but it's a case of making sure that we stick on top of this reinforcement message just to make sure that people are using it. And when we get to the trends piece on the data, we will be able to see if we've done this training correctly, and we can see people are using it. If in 6 weeks, 2 months time, we can see that Kieran is no longer using Teams meetings, for example, we can identify that we've got something odd going on. If Kieran's left, then fine, okay, that's not a problem. But if we can see that Kieran is not using Teams meetings anymore, then maybe he's gone to something else shadow, in which case we can pull that to the surface, address it, deal with it, get him back on board. So we want to make sure that whatever duration the project takes, the reinforcement phase lasts for a couple of months or 6 months afterwards to make sure it's really hammered home that this is the corporate tool, this is what we want to use, this is the way we want you to work. So now we'll have a look at the ACM demo, which I just need to change screens on again. Okay, there we go. Right. So this is our usage module, or our ACM module, goes by several names. And again, very, very similar sort of layout. On the left-hand side, you have some pre-canned reports, and across you have the ability to filter by user adoption group or department, whatever it may be. Now, in this one, we have a slightly different approach in the fact that we actually score the system here. So you will see in various different screens that there is a score of 10. That does not mean that that person or that team is perfect. What it means is that they are the most prolific users. So from this, we can see a straightforward overview, and we can see that the usage is up and down over time. Obviously, if you were rolling out the project, you would expect to see teams go up and up and up and up and up. And any of this stuff, again, is drilled through. So we can right click on it and we can drill through to the data behind it. The principle that we talked about with the security and governance about if we can measure something, then we can set a threshold, then we can set an action, still applies. What that action is obviously up for discussion. But we have several things like the team's activity summary, which will tell you which are the most active teams, so that we can see, just a straightforward overview. And you can rate it. Any of this stuff is filtered, so we can look at how many posted files, so which is the most used from a file perspective, etc., etc. So we can carve it up a number of ways again. We then have a team score. Okay, so this is against the actual teams, which are the most used teams. So there's that score of 10. As I said, doesn't mean it's the best team, but compared to the other teams, it's the most active one. And we again start to get a breakdown of what's in there, what's happening, etc., and who the people are within those teams that are using it. Where we get into some interesting information is where we start to get down into the users, and this is where it fits in with the adoption and change management piece. We can be, from a data level, we can be very, very granular about what we access. That is not the purpose of this tool set. It is not there to see that Kieran took far too long to respond to a message. That's not the point. What we're looking at here is saying, well, these are our users. These are the people who are most active in it. They've got scores of 10, they've done lots of replies, they've created threads, that's great. Am I bothered about those 10 scores? Yeah, I am, because those are probably going to be the champions who we want to start giving out positive stories, and this is how it's changed our department, and la 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 la. I'm probably more worried about the people who are scoring 1 or 2 or somewhere down here, because those people are disengaged. Now, it might be that they have a perfectly valid reason for being disengaged. Maybe they work in an environment where they don't need to particularly respond, they just need to see some messages come in. That might be fine, but at least we've actually looked at it and we've checked out to see whether or not that is the case. And we're not just assuming that they don't really need to use it, because if they are disgruntled, or if they don't have the knowledge, or if they just don't get it, we can address all of those things. We're not leaving it again to fester and become a problem. So we want to look at those scores. We can go down to a particular user, a use, like how quickly or how effectively people are responding. Where would I use this kind of data? Well, it's quite simple, really. I don't want to become Big Brother, but if I see a pattern that is emerging, that I've tagged Kieran 5 times in various different teams and channels, and Kieran just repeatedly doesn't respond, that for me is an alarm bell, because Kieran's disengaged. And if Kieran doesn't respond, then we'll end up going back to things like email, etc., where it's not in the environment we want it to be in. We want to encourage Kieran to start responding into teams. So maybe if we see that over a couple of weeks, Kieran's just not responding, we might want to just send a message going, do you know what? Your colleagues are trying to get hold of you. Here's a little video to show you how to respond. Or maybe we'll give them a link to take them straight to where the action was. If that continues on that pattern and Kieran still doesn't respond, then maybe we push that back to a champion or to the project team to find out what's going on with Kieran. You know, maybe it's a technical issue, maybe he's turned off his notifications, maybe it's an education thing, who knows? But we want to understand why. But it means that you're not looking through all of the data to try and find, you know, the needle in the haystack. It's almost like somebody's presenting the needle to you and going, oh, look, there's one. So that's what we're trying to do with this. We're trying to surface useful information, and if possible, maybe we can automate it. Kieran, you've been joining Teams meetings, but you're only using audio. When everybody's working from home, try using video. Here's how you turn it on. Here's how you blur your background. Here's how you put a pretty picture of the you know, the Millennium Falcon or whatever it may be as your backdrop. So we can make it encouraging. This is not necessarily about a tool to beat people up with. This is about drawing out where people might not be engaged, and we want to find out why they're not engaged. The ones that are engaged, yeah, bring them out, publicize them in Yammer or whatever it may be as a good use case. We can also look down at what kind of devices are being used to see whether or not somebody is, you know, spending too much time on a particular device. One of our clients asked whether or not we could use this data from a well-being perspective. Okay, we can see over this 3 to 4 week period that actually Kieran, poor old Kieran, he gets stuck with a lot, doesn't he? That Kieran is working at 6 o'clock in the morning and he's working at 8 o'clock at night, and he's using his device, his mobile device, repeatedly, and that's a sustained pattern. We can see that it's not just a blip on the you know, on the horizon. So maybe we send him a message going, Did you know you could set your working hours on your mobile client so you don't get disturbed after 7 o'clock? Something simple like that. But again, it's how you use that data to really sort of encourage and protect and enthuse your user base. And again, how quickly are people reacting? Are they responding? Who are the most responsive people within the organization, that kind of thing. The other thing is, as I said, is the trends. So we can see the trends, and we can split these trends up by department, by group. We can carve it up in a number of ways. But the trend piece is very much there about, we want to look at sustainability. And as I said earlier on, if we can see that somebody's been really using meetings a lot and then they drop off a cliff, and that's a sustained pattern, then we want to understand why they've dropped off a cliff. So again, we can automate it, or we can flag it back to a champion, or we can put it to the head of department. Where it goes, what via notification, I don't mind. But it's surfacing that information. Why are these people disengaged? Let's try and help them. So this is where we get this really, really sort of ingrained usage. And we do that. The modules, so the bots and the automation that come with the usage is slightly different to the adoption and change management one that comes out of the tin, because the adoption and change management is very much, I've trained you on this. Let's see if you're using this, and let's make sure you continue to use this. And if we see patterns where it's dropping off a cliff and we're not getting that buy-in, that engagement, that ongoing traction, then we can bring it to that surface, as I said, and deal with it straight on. So that is largely the demo piece. The usage part, as I said, the way that sort of varies is because that becomes much more of a longer term piece. It sort of goes on post rollout. ACM would be rollout plus a few months or 6 months or whatever it may be. The usage module becomes very much more a long-term sort of operational view whilst you settle it in for a period of time. So that is the demo for that. Let's have a little look now. If I flick back to another screen. Ooh, where are we? Okay. So let's have a look at common stumbling blocks. Okay, so this is where we see the adoption and change management side come unstuck within an organization. The first one is that lack of executive sponsorship. So from our perspective, the executive sponsorship is someone from the business prepared to sort of stick their neck out and say, this is our project, this is the way we want to work, this is why we want to work. It was that original message right at the very beginning, telling people why we're doing it, the impact of not doing it, that sort of information. We often get people who say, yep, we'll deal with the communications. And then we find out that the email has been sent out, or in one particular organization, the whole team's shift to Teams was buried as 0.2 out of 3 in a very long, wordy email. And effectively, it did nothing. So if you're going to communicate the change out to your users, do it with enthusiasm, get it out there, do it in multiple streams. It's not a huge upheaval. We're just making sure that we're covering the people who look on Yammer, the people who are in Teams, people who are on email, maybe it's in stream, whatever it may be. Maybe it's a broadcast to the entire organization, who knows? But just make sure that you have a solid approach to communicating the change. This one is a real problem that comes up time and time again. People will look at an adoption and change management story and go, oh, yeah, no, we've got that in place, we've got that in control. And when you look at what they're actually doing, it's straightforward training. We know that training, and most organizations, you sit in a room, somebody trains you on it. We do a remote session, somebody trains you on it, and you listen to it, and then some emails come in and you start getting distracted. Straightforward training is not effective. It doesn't have that messaging and that reinforcement piece. And that's super important. So don't dress training up as ACM. If you're going to do training, be straight with yourself. Okay, this is training. We're going to turf it out. We're going to push it out to everybody. We're going to do it in large swathes. But you can expect that lower level of adoption if that's the route you go down there. Not looking at the evidence of usage. This for me is super important. I've trained you on 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You're using 1 and 2. Yeah, I want to make sure that you're using 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that you're happy with what you've got. So we need to make sure that not just are people logging in and using Teams, but are they actually doing what we want them to do? So that is super important. Not addressing the resistance early. That's the piece we talked about with where we can see the disengaged users. So we want to make sure again that we address that early and it doesn't have time to boil into, you know, the culture, as if people sit there and go, well, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this, and then they talk to their friends and all the niggles come out. So we need to make sure we nip it in the bud and deal with it. Sheep dip mentality, people learn in different ways. The broad brush approach to training, I was going to say it's largely gone. It has in part come back because of the COVID situation at the moment. So we are engaged in some places where we are doing just very large scale training, but we're trying to reinforce that with the data that we have access to. But just applying a sheep dip mentality of everybody learns in the same way typically will not get you the best results. Oops, that's the wrong way. As I said earlier on, we need to make sure that the champions of the IT services are also comfortable, because they are also users as well as people who are going to affect the change for you. So, you know, it's very easy to think IT people, they're all IT literate, they'll pick it up. They will, but there's also a cultural change that we need to build into how they use the teams themselves and how they interact with other people. And quite often, actually, there's a lack of recognition for people in the teams and the champions delivering change. Doesn't need to be much, doesn't need to be financial or anything. It's the recognition. These guys were really good. They helped us hugely. And that often gets missed off. So we are on just about 11:30. That's the end of the pre-canned content that we have to go through. Do we have any questions? Paul, has anything come in?
Well, we've actually got one from the previous session, Pete.
Okay, let's deal with that one then. Let's do it.
Can you automate the messages out to people on the elements of non-compliance?
Yes, absolutely. So close your eyes, don't look at anything. Actually, I can line it up because it's on the wrong screen, isn't it? So let me line this up first. Bear with me 2 seconds. Right, let's just use an example here. I shall change screens so you can see. The message that goes out, the format, the wording, that kind of stuff is entirely up to how you wanted to behave. But we can have this, we've called it a teamwork tip spot, but actually you could call it your, governance service or whatever it is that you want to. But you can turn around and say, yeah, this is, you own one team. These are the people that are, the guests that are in these teams. And put whatever across the messages that you need to. So you can definitely phrase it however you want. There's an interesting one down here, which is somebody's deleted a team, and therefore I've been notified that the team has been deleted. So yes, that security and governance piece can definitely be automated. The more you can automate it, the more focus you can place on the pieces that are much more critical. So there's a second bot here. So we turn around and say, this is the inactive team, for example. And what we've done is we've actually said, these are the inactive teams. What do you want to do with them? Do you want to chat? And you'll see that that's a link to take you to the chat. or do you want to archive it? If we go for something like the archive, we can build in a workflow using Power App. So it says, okay, I'm going to archive the team. I'm going to send a message to the other team owner to say, Pete wants to archive it. You okay with that? So we can build in logic from that perspective. How these look is entirely up to you. There's an ownership warning there. We've got teams with external guests in here to check the membership. It might be that further up here, that case where I'm trying to get hold of Kieran and Kieran's not replying. There we go. I've got a bot to say, oh, do you know what? You're being asked these questions. Let's take you to it. Up here, there's another one saying that, you know, on the behavior and usage, etc., we might want to go down and encourage the use of video. But yes, absolutely. As I said, if we can measure it, we can set a threshold. If we can set a threshold, then we can put an action against it. That action could be an email, it could be a chat message, it could be, you know, a number of things. But yes, anything that we can measure and that we can identify is out of line with governance and compliance, then yes, we can send an automated message. It's about finding that right balance. That's a very wordy answer, wasn't it?
Thanks for that, Pete. I don't think there's any more questions that have come through at the moment. I'm just wondering, I think, Richard, in terms of your sort of thought on this, and whether you'd have any questions from your experience in the field.
So apologies, I had to jump off for a little while on this call. So I think, I mean, the sort of questions I get asked and people are really nervous about when they're rolling out teams is, you know, is there going to be the you know, when you create a team, it creates a SharePoint repository. Are there going to be SharePoint repositories, you know, littered everywhere so we can't find anything? Is there governance that we can put in place, you know, that can stop that? Is there governance around naming conventions that you know, organisations can put in place? Because I think the you know, people are really worried about the ability for end users just to really, you know, start up a team, create a team, and, you know, and be creating teams on a you know, on a regular basis, you know, multiple teams every day. I mean, the truth behind that is that, you know, people haven't got the time or the inclination to do that, and they might do it a little bit in the start of it. But I think, you know, we've seen that doesn't really happen. However, are there tools, and did you go through any tools that can really either A, report on this, or B, stop it or control it?
I think the short answer to that is yes. You missed that entire section.
Brilliant.
So
all I can say is I'm glad you went through it, because that's the single biggest question that I get asked by customers, and certainly, you know, when people have got, you know, in the KIM teams, the knowledge and information management, you know, is there going to be this proliferation of teams to make sure that they can actually find all of the information? But it sounds as though you covered that, so that's great news.
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's like, you know, we did cover off like naming conventions and DLP and bringing all of these various bits and pieces together. But also, you know, we don't want to stifle the creativity of the users. If they need a team for that, then, you know, maybe they need a team for whatever, you know, for that purpose. But it's basically giving them freedom, but controlled freedom. Yeah. And that's the key to it, really, is making sure, yeah, absolutely, if you tick all of these boxes, then you can have your team, and that's great. And that is where we hook the way that we bring, you know, the way that we approach it is slightly different to, in Microsoft, you have, you know, the ability to apply naming conventions, etc. You have the ability to apply, you know, prefixes and suffixes and all this sort of stuff based on the usage of the team or template, whatever it may be. But for us, we want to bring that all into one place, so that the user sits there and goes, I want to create a team like this, and I want it to be called that. Oh, hang on, no, sorry, you've already got one called that. It's this. Do you want to join that? Or yeah, I'm going to want to submit it for verification anyway. So it's about using those Microsoft tools that are available, but bringing it all into one place so that, you know, IT functions and users alike don't have to go off into multiple different places to apply different policies, to apply, etc., etc. So yeah, it's all about bringing it into one easy stream.
And it's like anything with security and governance, it's there's that fine line, isn't there, that you've got to apply enough security and governance in order to still make it usable, as opposed to if you go down the wrong way, you will stifle that creativity. But certainly, you know, that's what we can help with, and Modality can help with. So is there anything else, Paul or Pete, from you guys before we wrap this up?
Well, there's no other questions that have come through.
Okay, fantastic.
I think people have probably heard enough of my voice, quite frankly.
I'm sure that's not the case, Pete. But so I think from me, just to say a really heartfelt thanks to everyone on the call that made it this week, and if you made it last week as well. Again, fantastic. I'll be reaching out to each and every one of you just to find out what your thoughts were and what the next steps are really in the whole Teams journey. Because as I said right at the start of both this webinar and last week's, Teams is at the forefront of the collaboration in these challenging times. So I think it's really key that we understand what Teams can do for us, but at the same time making sure that Teams is rolled out in the right way, both from an IT and security perspective, and also from end users as well. I'd like to thank Modality for putting together the majority of the content on here. Well, in fact, all of the content. I've had the easy job of just topping and tailing. So Pete, thanks for for your time. I know these sort of things do take a lot of time. So thanks again to Modality. Really appreciate it, and thanks to each and every one of you for taking your time. So enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, and yeah, I'll be speaking to everyone soon. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you. Cheers.